Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. We're grateful to have you again. Today, we're going back to an exciting energy topic around nuclear energy and also the communication strategy policy around nuclear energy. We have an expert in this space today, Jeff Navin. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. Let's start with your current role and how you're involved with TerraPower's Natrium project, which is the advanced reactor under construction already in Kemmerer, Wyoming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Holly. Yeah, as you said, my name is Jeff Navin. I'm the Director of External Affairs for TerraPower. And in that role, I handle all of TerraPower's engagements with the federal governments, a lot of the engagements with state government, and then oversee our communications as well as we tell the story about what we're doing in Kemmerer, both for audiences in Wyoming and across the country and increasingly across the world.
Great. So let's dig in a little more on your career history for a minute. You're no stranger to energy, and you served at the highest levels of the Department of Energy. You were chief of staff there at one point in your career, among other high-profile roles. So we work a lot with the Department of Energy, really appreciate all they do for the energy sector in the U.S. Can you talk about your time there and what you learned at the DOE?
Yeah, it was a great opportunity to really see energy holistically at a time when, energy was really changing, and it still is. So I was the deputy chief of staff and then the acting chief of staff there during the Obama administration. So Steve Chu was the secretary for most of my time there, and then it transitioned to Ernie Moniz, both, world-class scientists. Chu won the Nobel Prize in physics, and Ernie was a longtime professor and leading energy thinker at MIT. And what was interesting, so this was kind of like in the kind of 2011, 2012, kind of that time frame. And the energy department was organized in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was really kind of organized at a time when there were a whole different set of energy challenges that the country was facing. And, we had a fossil energy department, we had a nuclear energy department, we had an energy efficiency and renewable energy department. And we started to see as we were going, as sort of the energy transition was really sort of picking up some steam, that a lot of these subsectors were interacting with each other in different ways than they had, in the past. We had just started exporting LNG. We were seeing the rise, big rapid decreases in costs of things like renewable energy, and the beginning of this kind of second renaissance in nuclear energy as well. And so I think a lot of folks, energy for many, many decades was kind of fairly stagnant, right? We had coal and gas, kind of, the primary workhorses that were producing electricity for us. You had these kind of cool but very nascent technologies like wind and solar and energy storage and electric vehicles that were, very much on the horizon, but not playing a huge role in people's lives. And, nuclear, something that sort of people had written off as kind of a technology of the past that was kind of being reinvented as a technology of the future. So it was this really interesting place to sit in the secretary's office and look at all of these changes that were happening throughout every aspect of the energy sector. And, I think that the energy industry can often be, particularly on the electricity side, can often be kind of, small c conservative, like we've always done it this way, we're going to continue to do it this way. And we just saw across the board all of this change being put, into every aspect of how we produce and consume and conceptualize and think about energy. So that was when I got really excited about what this opportunity, could look like. And when I left government, started doing some consulting work around those questions, right? You had investors, you had technologists and entrepreneurs, and then you had policymakers wrestling with new questions. How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with affordability? How do we deal with energy independence and national security? And I just found all of those things super fascinating and sort of jumped in the middle of it, and have been very fortunate to be able to continue to work at the intersection of some of those really, really big questions.
That's a really interesting time that you were at the Department of Energy. And I love that you use that word holistically, like seeing all these different energy sources, how they interplay together, and how you look at the whole energy sector. So that it sounds really exciting. And that's definitely something we try to do here. We understand all these energy types, they have to work together to form our grid and our all our energy mix, not just electricity. And one thing you didn't mention was resiliency, which nuclear energy is really important. And for folks who aren't familiar with that term in the energy sector, it really means making sure that, you have reliable energy. And that's another factor. And so you came to this energy sector really with an advocacy and communications background. I think there's probably no other part or sector of the energy area, the energy space, where communications and public engagement is so important than nuclear energy, especially now as we're seeing new reactors and new designs be proposed, and even here in Wyoming be under construction, and explaining how these are different, trying to understand how the permitting process might need to look different for those. It is a really exciting time to be talking and working in nuclear energy. But you said you were kind of, when you were at Chief of Staff, that's at the Department of Energy, that's over everything. Mm-hmm. So did you always expect to be involved in nuclear energy, or was that kind of a surprise?
Well, it's interesting. So I came out of government, and again, when like I said, I worked for two secretaries who were, physicists, world-class physicists, some of the best in the world. And so there was never a question in talking to them about the important role that nuclear energy was going to play. And this was a Democratic administration, right? And so I just sort of assumed that, I guess the left has changed its position on nuclear power, and they're all in favor of it because all of the people that I was working with that were in the Obama administration were all on board with, we need nuclear. It's got to be part of the solution. And then when I left government, I kind of ran into some environmentalists who hadn't yet had that conversion. And I actually did a project. This was well before I was working with TerraPower, and did a project to try to help move the consensus among some of the environmental and climate focused groups to be more supportive and embrace nuclear power as part of our climate solution, right? I mean, if you go back in time, you had a lot of these groups and a lot of these activists saying that, climate change is the most important environmental issue ever, that it was a existential crisis for the planet, and that we needed to do everything we could to solve the problem. And you'd say, great. So that means you're pro-nuclear, right? And they would be like, well, maybe not, right? And so I started doing some work with a group of mostly left of center, but some right of center groups that were trying to work on climate change, that build consensus around the actions we needed to take on climate change. And, you had a lot of these groups saying, we got to trust the scientists when it comes to climate, but they weren't also willing to trust the experts when it came to what those solutions could be. So we got a bunch of modelers together to look at what it would take to actually get to an electricity system that provided reliable, resilient, 24/7 electricity to people, which is, a non-negotiable, something that we absolutely have to have in this country and across the world, and ask them to model something out that didn't include these technologies like carbon capture and nuclear and these other kind of, at the time, somewhat controversial technologies within the climate community. And I think, and we actually got quite a few of those groups to shift their opinion. And so we started to see some of these things, like even when you had the far left, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Green New Deal, that was originally crafted as a 100% renewable energy plan. And then, as it moved forward and it got introduced into Congress, they actually changed it to 100% clean energy to include technologies like carbon capture and nuclear. And I think, that work was really important because there really isn't a path forward, a credible path forward to do what these climate groups want to do if you don't include some of these alternative technologies. And that's kind of what I was doing when, I got a call from TerraPower to join their team. And so I had been working in nuclear, but really kind of on the advocacy side of trying to get more support for nuclear power on the left. And I think that's something we've been very successful at. I mean, there certainly are environmentalists that oppose nuclear power, but I would say that's more of a fringe group now than it was, 10 years ago when that was kind of the predominant view held by people who identified as environmentalists.
That's a great story. I think the other thing, so clearly your background, you have been on the kind of left side of the political spectrum working on this space, but actually nuclear energy is very bipartisan.
It's very bipartisan. Yeah. And I mean, you think about, our biggest champions for nuclear, if you think about the Congress, you've got John Barrasso, who, rock solid conservative. Nobody would accuse of being anything but a, very conservative, reliably conservative. And then you've got, people like Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who are about as far left on the political spectrum as you get in Congress, and both of them are big champions for nuclear power, obviously for different reasons, but it is, knock on wood, it's like the last part of energy that hasn't become totally politicized. The last vote that we had in the Senate, something related to nuclear power, was on the ADVANCE Act, which was something that Senator Barrasso worked very, very hard to help get enacted. Senator Lummis as well in her role at the Environment and Public Works Committee. It passed, I think, 88-3. So you have 3 votes against something. I don't think you could go to the Senate today and say the sky is blue and the sun will rise tomorrow and get only 2 or 3 votes against it. So we're very lucky to have that bipartisan support, but it's taken some work to hold that coalition together.
Well, and in all fairness, the sky here in Laramie is actually completely gray today.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So I love, and it's very refreshing to hear that there are these that nuclear can be bipartisan, and it's something kind of the full national level folks can agree on. What reasons other than climate are you seeing probably from the right on why they support this technology or different nuclear technologies?
Yeah, I'd say it's 2 things. One is I think the right Republicans have been very concerned about this resiliency and reliability argument, which is understandable. And I think nuclear kind of fills that role very, very well, as you sort of mentioned a few moments ago. It's not weather dependent. It can run 24/7. It can provide that baseload power to sort of be the backbone of your electricity system. I think second, in addition, there are real national security implications of nuclear power. China and Russia are actively using their state-owned nuclear technology companies to spread their political influence around the globe. And as more and more countries are looking for alternatives to conventional fuels that they've been using to produce electricity that don't emit carbon dioxide, the demand globally for nuclear is going up. And the Russians, when they sell you a nuclear power plant, they're not just selling you a nuclear power plant. They provide the financing, they provide the fuel, they provide the operations, literally the people who will run the plant for many decades. They actually take back the spent fuel. So you're talking about a 60 to 80 to 100-year relationship with a country if you're Russia and you're selling them a reactor. And it's kind of like a virtual Gazprom pipeline into that country. And it allows them to influence their macro political thinking, their alliances, all of those things. And the U.S. needs to have those tools as well, that we can offer a non-state-owned alternative that allows these countries to remain in the free market and have those alliances with democratically aligned countries as well. So, obviously there's like an acute need to make sure that we are continuing to produce electrons in Kemmerer and, keep the lights on in Wyoming. But there's a broader international macroeconomic angle to this stuff as well. And I think that over the many, many decades where you had environmental opposition, I think that environmental opposition also just created a soft spot in the heart of many conservatives to say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And, we've been very lucky to have consistent and broad support among Republicans and grateful to have this newer support among Democrats as well.
That's great. And of course, for Wyoming, and you mentioned several members of our federal delegation being the nation's largest uranium producer, we have that as well going for us. That would, of course, make us supportive of nuclear energy. And just for anyone who doesn't know, Gazprom is the Russian kind of natural gas company, state-owned Russian company that feeds natural gas to Europe. And they've definitely used that natural gas to kind of use it as a political tool, right? And been willing to shut it off. So I think, to your point, national security certainly is part of energy security. So appreciate that kind of global holistic view. So you've already started to pivot into what's happening in Wyoming. So let's go there next. So you were involved in the site selection process for TerraPower's Natrium project, which is the new power facility, nuclear power facility being built in Kemmerer, Wyoming. So can you talk about early engagement in the state before that was announced and before it was public, and the process that was used to select Kemmerer specifically as the site for that new power plant? I mean, and I want to really highlight how groundbreaking this is, like figuratively and literally, that this is a first of the kind anywhere in the world facility, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And I think, again, we had the stars aligned for us, with Wyoming being where we decided to build our reactor for a whole host of reasons that we can talk about. But you take a step back, and TerraPower has won an award from the U.S. Department of Energy. It's called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. And it was established by Congress to help U.S. reactor companies compete with these state-owned global competitors, the Chinese companies, the Russian companies, the French, and the like. And it allows us to build the first of a kind reactor with a cost share from the federal government. Nuclear is hard, right? It's capital intensive, which is the fancy way of saying it costs a lot of money to do your first of a kind. All of our components have to be custom made. We have to build a fuel fabrication facility. We don't have a supply chain in place. And so the cost of your first reactor is much, much higher than subsequent reactors. And getting over that hurdle to get your first one built was something that the U.S. government said, this is something we want to help industry with, so they can kind of get over that hump. And then once you've got your first reactor built, you can use that as a reference plan and go sell subsequent plants around the country. We initially applied, and our plan was to build our reactor in eastern Washington state at the site of the Columbia Generating Station at the Hanford site. And when we won, we found out that the other company, X Energy, that won, they also selected that site as to where they wanted to build their reactor. Our partner, Energy Northwest, said, look, we made the commitment. We can try to build both of these reactors, but we knew it was going to be very hard to build two brand new reactors at the same site at the same time with a small utility partner. So we started to look for alternatives. And that's when we were approached by Pacific Corp and Rocky Mountain Power. And they said, look, we have a challenge here. We have announced that we're going to close 4 coal plants in the state of Wyoming, and we need replacement generation. We think nuclear could be a really good fit. How do you feel about Wyoming? And we had a few conversations very early on with the utility, with Governor Gordon, with the federal delegation, Senator Barrasso, Senator Lummis, and at the time it was Congresswoman Cheney. And the enthusiasm was really off the charts. And, a lot of times when you go talk to politicians about energy, you have to start with the very basics. Not in Wyoming. Wyoming is a very energy literate state, and everybody in the state knows that, electricity doesn't come from the light switch, which is kind of the joke about how most Americans, think about where their electricity comes from. So we had really, really encouraging conversations there. And then we did something a little bit different, which is that we announced with the governor that we were going to be, and Rocky Mountain Power, Pacific Corp, that we would be building our first reactor in Wyoming, but we didn't select the site. And what we said was we wanted to make sure that we were going to pick a place that really wanted this and saw the opportunity and the value. We were not going to try to push the rock uphill and force a nuclear power plant into a community that didn't want it. There were 4 communities that were hosting coal plants that had been slated to be retired, and we went to each of those communities. We did town hall meetings. We met with local officials. We met with community leaders, and we said to them, let us know if you'd like to host the plant. We answered their questions beforehand, and all 4 of the communities raised their hand and said, we would like to be considered and we'd like you to build the plant here. Kemmerer was very aggressive in letting us know that they were interested. They put together PowerPoint presentations trying to lobby us, to sell us on the idea of coming to Kemmerer. Kemmerer made a lot of sense for a whole lot of reasons, but one of them was they were the first, the Naughton plant in Kemmerer is the first of the 4 slated to come offline. It's the smallest of the communities that we looked at. When you think about Lincoln County, you have the coal plant there, and then adjacent to the coal plant is the coal mine. And, both of those the plant was slated to be retired. It was putting a lot of pressure on the mine as well. And the community was going to take a huge economic hit when that retirement announcement was made. And so we just felt like the enthusiasm that Kemmerer had, the need that they had, our ability to not only replace the jobs that they were going to lose, but expand upon it was something that was really important for us as we made that decision. And so we selected Kemmerer. I think that I'm pretty sure this is the first time anywhere in the world that a site selection for a nuclear power plant was put in the hands of community members rather than, executives in a utility or politicians somewhere. And so I think that has really served us well, because when we made the announcement that we were coming to Kemmerer, instead of being met with skepticism and questions, we were met with enthusiasm and a lot of support from local officials there. So, I think that hopefully one of the many things that we've done at TerraPower to help kind of move the nuclear industry along. One of them is just changing the way people think about how they do site selection and how they're engaging these communities, even before a decision's made to bring a nuclear power plant into those communities.
That is a really great story. And I totally agree. Bring your A game when you're talking energy around the state of Wyoming. You wouldn't believe some of the questions I've gotten in town halls. Chevron deference, questions about the Supreme Court ruling, you name it. So it's tough out there.
Yeah, it is. And I will say, again, there is something very special about Wyoming. People know where they're in, like, as you mentioned, you've got coal, you've got gas, you've got oil, you've got uranium, you've got wind. There's literally no aspect of energy that Wyoming isn't a leader in. And that's very, very rare. Most states have maybe one or two of those things, but not all of them, or 0 of them. And Wyoming really has all of them. And so we've enjoyed a lot of support and partnership with the Wyoming Mining Association because of the uranium deposits that happen to be in Wyoming. So we're hopeful that not only can we replace the jobs at the Naughton coal plant, but as we are helping to unleash this new national and international interest in nuclear, that we can get some of those uranium mines restarted again as well.
So you're no stranger to this part of the country. You've already highlighted several different reasons that Wyoming was selected and why you think it's a good location. So you received your undergraduate degree from the University of South Dakota. Is that right?
That's right.
And so you've been around this part of the country. Is there anything else about the region or Wyoming specifically that you haven't mentioned that you think makes it an ideal location for energy innovation and specifically for nuclear?
Yeah, I'd say a few things. So I was born and raised in South Dakota, right next door, and got my undergraduate degree there. And so I'm very, Wyoming does feel like home to me. The people, the work ethic, the wind, right? The cold and the wind in the winter. I'm very familiar with all of those things. But I think that when you come from a small state, there's a partnership and a kind of, you kind of put your differences aside and you just sort of roll your sleeves up and get things done. And we've just seen that across the board, whether it's the Industrial Siting Commission, whether it was our early engagement with the legislature, whether it was the great partnership we've had with the governor, with the delegation. When you show up and you are, authentically interested in trying to help a community, you get all the support that you need. And, we've had just across the board, we've been welcomed, right? Whether it's in Cheyenne, whether it's in Kemmerer, whether it's anywhere across the state. there were a lot of people who kind of looked at us sideways in the industry saying, you're going to build a first of a kind nuclear power plant in a state that doesn't have any nuclear with a utility that doesn't have any nuclear. And not only does Rocky Mountain Power not have nuclear, neither does Pacific Corp or even Berkshire Hathaway Energy, right, in their entire system. And people kind of looked at us like, well, why aren't you just going with a Constellation or, one of these other utilities that owns and operates a bunch of nuclear power plants? But, we have just from the beginning, people got it. They understood what we were trying to do. They had very legitimate concerns about safety, about how we were going to deal with the community, treat the community. But they also allowed us to answer those questions, and they took us at our word, and they were willing to do the work, to do their own learnings, to understand what the opportunity was going to be for the state. And so that's just that energy intelligence is a big part of it. I think, being able to shake someone's hand and have that mean something, take people at their word. And, one of the real challenges we're going to have as we continue to build this thing is finding qualified and quality workers that can help us build this thing. And we know that there's so many people in Wyoming that have built incredibly complex things, and we're going to need those welders, those pipe fitters, those electricians, all of those folks to help us get this thing across the finish line. You can't change the culture of a place when you're going to build a reactor or something this complex. And coming into a place like Wyoming, where there is very much a we will get it done attitude, a solid and intense work ethic, and a commitment to helping your neighbors. I mean, you can't think of a better place to try to pull something off like a first of a kind nuclear build. You can't think of a better place and a better culture and a better group of people to build it with than what we found in Wyoming.
Wow, that's a really great story. Well said. And quick plug, self-serving quick plug, that the School of Energy Resources here at the University of Wyoming is working with our partners at the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences, and we are standing up a nuclear energy science certificate. And what we've found is University of Wyoming students are really interested in this field. And they're looking for new credentials. So
that's great. And we're seeing that across the board. We hear from nuclear engineering programs and then engineering programs adjacent to nuclear that the number of people who are just young people who are interested in doing big things and taking on these audacious projects, they're filling up those classrooms. So that's great. We've had a great partnership with the university, and we really do want this plant to be the first of many, and for Wyoming to be really at the center of this advanced nuclear industry. And, we talked about this. One of the things that I've done is I've traveled to Vienna to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And when you say Kemmerer, they know it's in Wyoming. They know it's where we're building this plant. Like, Kemmerer is a shorthand now that is understood by people in the nuclear industry all around the globe, and they're watching very closely. And one of the things that we're doing, and we haven't talked a lot about this, but at that site in Kemmerer, we're building a training center, and that training center is going to be where every Natrium power plant operator for these future plants around the globe is going to come and train. So there will be people from the East Coast and West Coast coming to Kemmerer to learn how to operate these plants. And there's going to be people from all over the world that are going to be spending time in Kemmerer, Wyoming, which is where the training facility for all of the Natrium power plants is going to be. So the first nuclear power plant, a commercial nuclear power plant in the United States, was built outside of Pittsburgh at a place called Shippingport in Pennsylvania. And Pittsburgh remains the headquarters of Westinghouse. It remains kind of the center of the domestic nuclear industry in the United States. And there's no reason that Wyoming and Kemmerer and Cheyenne can't have some of those spillover effects as well. So we want to build this plant. We want to make sure that we're keeping those jobs in Kemmerer. That's important. But we also have as one of our goals to make sure that Wyoming is kind of the center of this new advanced nuclear industry that we're hoping to launch in the United States.
And we really appreciate that, Jeff. And I should say, as we've developed that certificate, TerraPower has been helping us along the way to make sure it's relevant. And I totally agree with that point. I mean, if this first of a kind facility was the only thing that happened in Wyoming, it would be tremendous. But there are other opportunities here, and not the least of which is our uranium production, but there's other opportunities. And so it'll be exciting to see which of those opportunities Wyoming can leverage. And I think the Wyoming Energy Authority is really focused on understanding how they can support some of these other areas, manufacturing and other areas, to really double down on nuclear energy and leverage this incredible opportunity that you all have given us. So really appreciate that.
That's great. Yeah, we're, like I said, I mean, we have had zero regrets since making the choice to come to Wyoming. I think when we look back at the history of the company, we're going to look back at the choice to come to Wyoming as one of the most important and consequential decisions that we made that set us up for success.
No question. So, and as you said, this is your first of the kind demonstration. And to your point, I think it's a good point. You talked about why the costs are higher for a first of a kind. If you're making one part, one time, obviously that requires a higher cost than if you have an assembly line where you're always manufacturing something as opposed to a one-off. And so that's when it probably does make sense for the federal government to be involved, especially given the national security implications that you've talked about. But over time, with basically every energy technology, what we see is you build the second, third, fourth, and get to what we call nth of a kind, those costs do come down. And TerraPower's long-term goals include rolling out this technology, the Natrium technology, nationally and really internationally. So let's pivot a little and just talk a little bit about your outreach and engagement strategies at the national and international levels, even as you're focused on building this first plant in Wyoming. Talk about how you're laying the groundwork to deploy this technology in the US and around the world.
In some ways, it's hard to believe that it's only been, a few years since we made the announcement to come to Kemmerer, but really things have changed so much in the commercial landscape. One, I think it was important for people to see that we actually could do this. We can build one of these plants, and we've broken ground. We have construction workers on the site right now in Kemmerer, and all of those things, help make this very real, right? There's a big difference between a PowerPoint and a plan and actually submitting your license to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, breaking ground, having construction workers with hard hats, moving earth, pouring concrete, all of those things to get a project started. But, obviously the global response to carbon emissions and climate change has helped create a market for nuclear. And then we saw a couple of other things that have happened in recent years that have also helped increase that demand. Domestically, the load growth caused by data centers and AI and the growth of electric vehicles, the electricity sector in the United States has not seen a lot of demand growth over the last decade or so, and that's changing. And so as you've got these new, very power-hungry data centers that are going to need new load, new sources of electricity, that has really changed the domestic demand signals for nuclear. And then, internationally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine all of a sudden put a lot of Europe on notice that it's just not going to be sustainable to have to rely on Russian natural gas. And so we're starting to see more and more interest from Western Europe, Central Europe, and a lot of interest in Eastern Europe as well. And so, we kind of have those three demand drivers: countries and utilities looking to replace carbon emitting sources of electricity with non-carbon emitting sources of electricity, the data center demand in the United States, and then the sort of geopolitical response to Russia invading Ukraine has created, a lot of demand for the product. Now, the most important thing that we can do to market Natrium is build Natrium, right? So we're very much focused. I mean, we are the first mover in the West. We are the first non-Chinese or Russian-owned company to build an advanced reactor. And the more progress we make in Kemmerer, I think the more interest we're seeing from others. The biggest challenge that we're seeing in the advanced nuclear commercial space is legitimate concern from potential customers saying, are you a real company and can you really build this in time for what we need? And so we think we have an advantage by being the very first advanced nuclear company to have a commercial license pending in front of the NRC to begin and start construction. We will be the first one completed. And I think that's going to help us unlock a lot of those markets.
And so we have new federal administration coming into office with the Trump administration. Does that change your outreach activities, your kind of strategy to advancing nuclear energy in the U.S.?
Well, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program was actually started under the first Trump administration, and the TerraPower and X-Energy projects were selected during the Trump administration when you had Secretary Briette was Energy Secretary. And so we think that there's going to be a lot of pride of ownership, if you will, about these projects, sort of coming online during the Trump administration, getting through the Biden administration. But now that they've been able to get back into office, we're hoping that they see this as one of the crown jewels that they can help bring across the finish line and really, tout as one of their accomplishments. Like I said, we've seen a lot of growth in support for nuclear power on the Democratic side, but we've had pretty unwavering support on the Republican side. And President Trump has spoken very enthusiastically about nuclear. So we feel like, politically, we've got a lot of support in both parties, but this is something that this particular project is something that I think the Trump administration should be very excited about, given that it started in the first term.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you one question about the fuel.
Yeah.
So the type of fuel that the Natrium power plant will use is HALEU, which stands for high assay low enriched uranium. And there's been a lot of attention on where TerraPower will get the fuel for this facility. Obviously, even as you're announcing this project, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was occurring, and Russian uranium became something that obviously the U.S. did not want to be importing. So this is all happening as you're trying to build this facility. So can you talk about HALEU, why it's so difficult to source, and where the fuel will come from this facility?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And, just a brief kind of primer on nuclear fuel. So, making electricity from nuclear power is really a lot like a coal plant. It's the only difference is that instead of burning coal to create the heat, to generate the steam, to spin a turbine, we split atoms. And so we need a fissionable source in order to cause those atoms to split to create that heat. So we use uranium. And uranium is a, naturally occurring element. There's a lot of it in Wyoming, as we've talked about. But in order to use it as a fuel, you have to enrich it so that the fissionable isotope is at a higher concentration than what you would find if you pull it out of the ground. So the difference between an advanced reactor like TerraPower's and the 100 or so conventional reactors we have operating in the United States is the level of enrichment of that fissionable isotope. So all of the reactors that are currently operating in the US use low enriched uranium, which is uranium enriched to up to 5% of the total quantity from that fissionable isotope. We go up to about 20%. And why would we do that? Well, it's for a few reasons. One is it's a much more efficient use of the uranium. With the higher enrichment levels, we're able to get more energy out of each one of our fuel rods. We're able to burn them up to a higher degree, so there's less waste per volume of electricity that you produce. And it allows us to operate in a fast spectrum, which allows us to do all the cool things that an advanced reactor can do. The challenge we have is that because there aren't any of these advanced reactors currently operating in the United States, there's kind of a commercial issue, right? Nobody's going to make the investments to enrich up to HALEU levels if they don't have a customer. And from our perspective, this is the classic chicken and egg problem, right? Like we need to have that fuel in order to sell our reactors, but people aren't making the investments into that fuel because they don't see enough commercial demand at this point. So the US government, at the same time that they created the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, created a HALEU fuel availability program, which would allow the U.S. government to start buying HALEU in advance and then stockpiling that, and then we would buy the HALEU from this new federal program. There is one commercial supplier of HALEU on the market, as you mentioned, and that's Russia. So when we submitted our plan to DOE, our initial plan was to buy our first core load of HALEU from Russia, so it would be enriched in Russia. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine, it became clear that was not something that we were willing to do. Our plan was always just to buy one core load from Russia while the U.S. stood up this capability. And now we're really hoping that they can expedite the production of this domestically, so we have options in the U.S. where we can purchase the HALEU. It's not clear to us as to when that's going to be available. The government has moved very slowly in rolling out this program. All of the bureaucratic challenges that come with a government program are present here. And so we've got to wait for NEPA reviews. We've got to wait for all kinds of things that are slowing things down. We've made some very small investments into some facilities, both domestically, a facility in Ohio. We put some R&D money in to help a U.S. company called Centrist stand up their enrichment capabilities. And we recently made a small investment, or committed to make a small investment, into a company in South Africa that's an isotope production company that we think could produce HALEU on the time frame that we need it as well. So when you talk about supply chains for a first of a kind project, they're varied and they're difficult. And a lot of times you find as the company, you have to kind of step up and make some of these investments. And we're finding that with fuel as well. We have no intention or desire to be a fuel company, but without fuel, the reactor doesn't run. So we're finding ourselves having to kind of help unlock some of these things as well. I will just say, when you talk about HALEU, that's not a specific kind of uranium. It's just the capacity to do the enrichment. So regardless as to where the enrichment occurs, we absolutely still could use domestic sources or Wyoming sources of uranium for that project. With South Africa, there's a international framework that requires us to have an agreement with South Africa on the use of civil nuclear technology. And the U.S. government's currently negotiating that with South Africa. And we're hopeful that they'll get that done in time, that if we do choose to use South African enrichment, that we would have the option of using Wyoming uranium in that enrichment as well. So again, we're committed to trying to help the state grow its nuclear industry. And the fuel piece is one where there's a lot of opportunity in terms of the uranium that's in the ground in Wyoming, but some challenges in terms of needing to get that commercial enrichment capability up and running somewhere outside of Russia and China, where we can take that uranium and turn it into the HALEU that we need to fuel our reactor.
Great. Yeah, a lot of different things that have to come together for this facility, but really appreciate hearing the story of how you're working with all different groups to pull it all together. So, Jeff, thank you so much. We're just about out of time. For our last question, I'm going to switch gears a little. Sure. We always like to ask our guests a different type of question. So obviously you're from South Dakota, spent a lot of time in the region. What's your favorite place to visit in Wyoming?
Well, I have to say Kemmerer, just because
I know you did.
Yeah, I mean, it's just become such a tremendously welcoming place for us, and there will always be a special place in my heart for Kemmerer. They embraced us. They've taken a chance with us, and we've just, like I said, we just had absolute nothing but the welcome mat, rolled out for us. Our chairman, Bill Gates, has been there a couple of times. It's been really fun to see him there. The last time he was there, he sat in on a local poker game at one of the fossil shops there. And every time we go back to Kemmerer, you see something new has opened, right? The fossil fuel coffee shop, the restaurant at the Opera House, and I think to be able to see our investment in that community turning into so much optimism about the future of that community, it's been really, really great. So I get to Cheyenne quite a bit. I've been across the state, but Kemmerer is always going to have a pretty special place in my heart.
Great answer. And I will say, you pointed out a couple of times how energy literate or energy savvy Wyomingites are, but part of it is really understanding the full economic development that comes with energy, right? As you pointed out. So it's not just about the energy, but all that kind of resulting economic development, the coffee shops and the restaurants that serve workers and the hotels and everything that comes with it. So, and us here at the School of Energy Resources getting to work with entities like TerraPower and other folks in the energy sector here. So thank you so much for your engagement with Wyoming, for your investment in the state, and for doing this podcast.
Great. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.